And further, we read in verse 16, the Syrian invader will do with them as he pleases, without opposition. He will stand in the promised land and have it completely in his power. It's because it's affecting the nation of Israel that this history is recorded. You see, history interests us only in the way it affects the people of God. And that's why this chapter was written down for Daniel's instruction. In verse 17, the king of Syria will plan an expedition using his whole army. And then he does the reverse of what the king of Egypt did in a previous generation. In order to destroy his enemy's kingdom, he does the same thing. He will make an alliance with the king of Egypt. And this time, it's the other way around. He gives his daughter, Cleopatra, in marriage to Ptolemy in Egypt, hoping that his daughter will help him to defeat the enemy, but his plan will not succeed. It says, she will not take a stand for her father or be on his side. She took the stand of her husband, and her father, Antiochus the Great, was disappointed. Now this is, again, literally, it was like that in history. History gives us the names of these people. And then verse 18, after that he will attack the nations by the sea and conquer many of them, but a foreign leader will defeat him and put an end to his arrogance. Indeed, he will turn the arrogance of Syria's king back on him. And then verse 19, that's when the king of Syria was defeated by the Romans. And that's the period in the history of the world when the Roman Empire was just beginning to come up. It wasn't a world power then, it was beginning to come up. Then the king will return to the fortresses of his own land, but he will be defeated, and that will be the end of him. And that is the time when we read that this man Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great, was killed. And he will be followed by another king, that was his own son, who will send an officer to oppress the people with taxes in order to increase the wealth of his kingdom. And this too was literally fulfilled in history. But then after some time, in a very short time, that king will be killed, but not publicly and not in battle. History tells us that Antiochus the Great's son was poisoned by his own servants, and there was a fulfillment of what God had written there. He was not killed in battle, he was poisoned by his own servants. And then we read in verse 21 that after this son had died, poisoned by his servants, strictly speaking, his son should have come to the throne of the kingdom of Syria, but he did not. And verse 21 onwards describes a king, I'll just tell you his name in a moment, who rules Syria, who is one of the clearest types of the Antichrist that is ever recorded in the scriptures. And that's why it's significant from verse 21 onwards. Then the angel went on to explain, the next king of Syria will be an evil man who has no right to be the king, because he was not the son of the previous king, he was the brother of the previous king. But he will come unexpectedly, because the king's son was too small, and seize power by trickery. And that's exactly what happened. And he was known in history as Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes. And the significance for us of this man is that in the scriptures, he is portrayed as a type of the Antichrist. And he will come unexpectedly and seize power by trickery. And anyone who opposes him, verse 22, this happened about 175 years before Christ, including, and when it says there, the prince of the covenant, the old covenant representative in Israel at that time was the high priest. And that's referring to the high priest, and that's also true that there was a high priest in Israel at that time called Onias. We read of it in a book called the Book of Maccabees in the apocryphal books. And there we read about Antiochus Epiphanes in those books of the books of Maccabees. And there we read that the high priest himself was swept away and wiped out, as it says here in verse 22. And this Antiochus Epiphanes, verse 23, by making treaties, he will deceive other nations. Now, as you read along, remember this is a picture of the Antichrist that's going to come. And that's why a great deal of detail is given us about this particular king, almost till the end of the chapter. All the other kings, 175 years almost, was compressed into a very short passage of Scripture, verse 5 to 20. But when it comes to this particular king, great detail is given. And the significance for us is that here is someone who portrays for us the way the Antichrist is going to rise up in the last days. He will grow stronger and stronger, verse 23, even though he rules only a small nation to begin with. He will invade a wealthy province without warning and will do things that none of his ancestors ever did. He will divide among his followers the goods and property he has captured in war, and thus make friends with his followers and increase his popularity. And we read further, he will make plans to attack fortresses, but his time will soon run out. Then verse 25, it's still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. He will boldly raise a large army to attack the king of Egypt, who will prepare to fight back with a huge and powerful army. But the king of Egypt will be deceived by some of his own friends and will not be successful. His closest advisors will ruin him, and thus the king of Egypt will be defeated, and many of the Egyptian soldiers will be killed and his army will be wiped out. This literally happened when Antiochus Epiphanes invaded Egypt. Then here it speaks about the conference table, which is very familiar thing in these days. They have this conference table. The two kings will sit down at the same table, but their motives will be evil, and they will tell lies to each other. An exact description of all the conferences that go on for peace between the various nations today. And that's it happened before. It happened 165 years before Christ, and it's going to happen now in these days. The conference table, they will tell lies to each other and deceive each other. They will not get what they want because the time for it has not yet come. Then the king of Syria, verse 28, will return home with all the loot he has captured, determined to destroy the religion of God's people. You see, from Egypt he passes through Israel. And here is where he becomes a type of the Antichrist in Israel. He will do as he pleases and then return to his own land. Later on, he will invade Egypt again. But this time things will turn out differently. Because verse 30, the Romans will come in ships and oppose him. The ships of Kittim or Cyprus. And he will be frightened. The Roman power was building up at this time, particularly their fleet. And then he will turn back in anger and try to destroy the religion of God's people. Here is where, as I said, he becomes a picture of the Antichrist. And because the Roman fleet chased Antiochus Epiphanes out of Egypt, he came back to Syria and passed through Jerusalem. And now see what he did in Jerusalem, and we will see that this is exactly what the Antichrist is going to do in Jerusalem in a future day. The double fulfillment of prophecy. And we read here, he will follow the advice of those Jews who have abandoned their covenant with God. There are going to be certain Jews who abandon their covenant with God and turn and take the side of the Antichrist. And that happened before, in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. And some of his soldiers will desecrate the temple in Jerusalem. And the way they did that was, they took a pig. They knew the Jews don't eat pigs, they don't eat pork. And they took a pig and sacrificed it on the altar in the temple. Antiochus Epiphanes did that, and he took a statue of Jupiter and placed it in the most holy place of the temple. That's a picture of how the Antichrist one day will set up his own image in the temple in Jerusalem in a future day. The dual fulfillment of prophecy. And then they will set up the abomination of desolation. This is the abomination of desolation which Jesus spoke of in Matthew 24. prefigured in the statue of Jupiter being put up by Antiochus Epiphanes 165 years before Christ. Now, Jesus said that we need to understand about this abomination of desolation. That's why we need to consider this passage of Scripture carefully.